how you became an entrepreneur, why you became an entrepreneur. You founded, I think, 2 companies, maybe more. That's just what's shown on LinkedIn. Like, walk me through what even pushed you to go down this totally crazy path of entrepreneurship.
I never really enjoyed college. It just wasn't for me. And I knew I wanted to get into tech at that point. I had done some discovery and kind of figured out that it's obvious now, but as a kid, I didn't know that there was a tech industry. I thought there were people who started businesses. Then I thought there were people who did computer stuff. And I was like, man, I wish there were a way to do both of those at the same time. And then
would you like define that as, I'm kind of put words in your mouth, but is that like grit? Basically just like founders who have grit. And then how do you judge that grit, or can you train yourself to can you train or convince yourself as a founder to have that level of grit and just say, I'm just going to keep sticking with it every day? Or is it something that just like is inherent, like going back to where you started, like, hey, you just were someone who's like, I'm going to go figure this out and be in my car with my $500 in my savings account and like go for it because I have that grit and I don't have any fear, right? Like the worst outcome is actually not that bad.
It's like, I don't know if I'm capable of doing anything. I don't have I wasn't programming all day. I'm not as good a programmer as the programmers. I'm not as good a salesperson as the salespeople. Clearly, I can say that I'm an operator, but how can I say that I'm an operator when the company just failed? But I think at the end of the day, I don't know how to cause it or create it so much as identify it. But there is maybe it's a psychology thing, but there are people for whom you can tell that they believe so deeply that they are going to be successful that you could throw anything at them and they'll figure it out.
Welcome to the next episode of the Entrepreneurial Excellence podcast. It's great to have Austen Allred with me today. He is the CEO and co-founder of BloomTech and just someone who's been in the startup ecosystem for a long time, seen a ton of different things happen, went through Y Combinator, just a great wealth of experience and learnings that I know I will gain a lot from today and hope everyone listening will as well. So Austen, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So what I would like to do is just kind of start off and set the stage, walk me through how you became an entrepreneur, why you became an entrepreneur. You founded, I think, 2 companies, maybe more. That's just what's shown on LinkedIn. Walk me through what even pushed you to go down this totally crazy path of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think so. I always wanted to. I was always very interested in business, even from when I was a little kid. I was, selling stuff on eBay when eBay first came out. And I loved the internet originally because it was a way to be taken seriously as like you were an adult when you were a kid. So that's kind of, where I grew up.
What's the old meme that no one knows you're a dog on the internet or something?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. No one knows you're a 12-year-old. Actually, way back in the day, PayPal hadn't created very strict security yet. So I had a fully blown credit card in my name as a 12, 13-year-old kid, which I'm pretty sure is illegal, but I'm sure statute of limitations has passed on that. So yeah, I basically lived online. I actually got the internet as a birthday present when I turned 8, which kind of shows what kind of kid I am.
Were your parents into tech? Were they entrepreneurs themselves? How did that become a thing for you?
No, not really. My dad was an accountant. My grandma worked at a company called Novell that used to be one of the old operating systems. So she had an Apple II. She still has it, one of the original 1984 Macintoshes. So we got into computers just playing with stuff at my grandma's house. And then when the internet came out, in the early days, it was AOL and it was on discs and stuff like that. But as a kid, that was incredible. That was the only way that you could access stuff without sending your parents to a bookstore or, so it, pretty quickly got on bulletin boards and the whole 9 yards. And my parents had some vague sense of what I was doing, but not really. And so it just kind of from then on pretty much till now, I kind of lived online as much as I lived, in the real physical world. I'd still go to school. I was still a normal kid, but, I lived on the internet pretty well. So
do you think, they're sort of skipping ahead in some ways, but do you think that is the genesis to some extent for BloomTech in general is using the internet to empower people in different ways? What was the sort of genesis of BloomTech?
Yeah, for
That's
sure. So when I was in college, I just, I never really enjoyed college. It just wasn't for me. And I knew I wanted to get into tech at that point. I had done some discovery and kind of figured out that like, it's obvious now, but as a kid, I didn't know that there was a tech industry. I thought there were people who started businesses. Then I thought there were people who did computer stuff. And I was like, man, I wish there were a way to do both of those at the same time. And then, slowly you hear about Silicon Valley. And this is, in the early, I mean, not the early-ish days of Silicon Valley, but, I remember reading TechCrunch when it was brand new and reading about Flickr. And you're like, oh my gosh, it was bought for $20 million. That's such a crazy sum of money. And so I knew I wanted to get to Silicon Valley. I knew I wanted to, be in tech. I just love technology. I love the accessibility it gives people. So I drove out to Silicon Valley. I lived in my car while I taught myself enough code to, be dangerous. And that was really the beginning point of my career when I started actually learning how this world works and what moves the needle and how stuff scales and how so that was the impetus. And then
Were your parents super like worried about you at all? I mean, if you're like, college isn't for me, I'm gonna jump in my car and go live in crazy Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and go just figure it out. Like, did that scare them, or are they just like cool parents like that? And they just like, nah, it's all good. We know Austin will do fine.
definitely, I mean, so there are aspects of it that scared them. Like the living in my car didn't really scare them. Like I had, I was interested in importing and exporting, so I moved to Shanghai like on a whim once, and I lived in Eastern Ukraine. So they were like, "Oh, Austin won't be able to handle himself in the wild so much as the big thing is that I was dropping out of college, which, on my dad's side, both of his parents are teachers. On my mom's side, they my grandma was the breadwinner and she had a master's degree, and like teaching was education was extremely important to my parents. So when and our family is huge and very close, so every Sunday we would have dinner at my grandma's house, and they basically staged an intervention, which was, Austin, do whatever you want, just don't drop out of college. Like why would you not come back? And I kind of got away with it saying, let me try this out. And I can go back. It's not like, to use the Jeff Bezos analogy, this is a two-way door. I can go back anytime, and I will if this falls flat on its face. But this is what I feel compelled to do, and maybe compelled isn't the right word. This is what I feel inspired to do. So I'm going to try it, and I'm going to try it my way. And I think the downside risk is pretty small. I had like $500 in my bank account, and I had, what can you lose as a 20 something kid? And it worked out great. So the main reason I started BloomTech is, I got into software, started, was making six figures and working in San Francisco. And when I go back to small town Utah, which is where I moved to San Francisco from, everyone would be like, "Oh my gosh, that's so cool. I'm going to do what you did. Like, tell me how to do exactly your journey." And I'd be like, "That, for you with five kids at home, that's not the right path. Even, moving somewhere and going to a code boot camp is not the right path for you." So the original vision was just, let's put the best education possible for moving people's incomes online. And, back in 2016, 2017, online was teaching somebody live online. Zoom had just barely come out. Slack was pretty new. So doing anything, teaching people online before that was, you have to go build a video server, and you have to like figure out how to, have to build your own video software. It just wouldn't have worked. So we wrote the tales of Zoom and Slack to get things going. But yeah, it was a little bit counterintuitive that you could actually teach people online at that time as well as you could in a classroom. That was the thing that we heard 10 times a day is, well, you can't learn online. People have tried that, and they'd point at some experiment where people like put a free class online, and look, only 1% of people completed it. And you're like, yeah, but that's like videos. It's like, yeah, it's not even remotely
Well, also
the same.
it's video, but it's also actually probably looking at the wrong numbers, because you might also have 10,000 people sign up for it. So sure, only 1%, 1% or some small number completes it, but so many more people are even trying. You're opening access up to such a wider and more diverse group of people.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And then, I mean, it would be like if you said, "Hey, there's a library, like, but not everybody's reading books. Like, the library is bad," And yeah, so it's just a completely different experience online too. You give me a class of 10 people and I'm talking, interacting with them. Like it's no mystery that if you just put a video online and say, and at the time it was, hey, here is 1,000 hours of video. Good luck. Like, yeah, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So
So what made it different with BloomTech? Like, why was BloomTech different? Because there's also like the rise, like Udemy and a bunch of other like massive online courses like started to come out into the world. Like Khan Academy, a bunch of these probably started around the same time. Was it just that trend that everything was sort of coming together?
So,
That,
so
or
I think the biggest thing was the temptation of cheap scale online is so tempting that you go from like, okay, here's a classroom, right? What does a classroom look like? Everybody has to show up at 5 p.m. Everybody is button seat. They're talking, interacting with an instructor. It's a two-way conversation, and then everybody goes home. And the people's understanding of how that goes online is you point a camera at the instructor, you record the lecture, and then you put that up as a video. And they say, hey, the class is online. But that's not at all, watching that video is not at all the experience of being in the classroom. There isn't the requirement, there isn't the interaction. So we built it wasn't really any building. We just ran a classroom via Zoom the same way you would run a normal classroom, and people would show up and they would, and then you get into later on, like, what do you automate? What can you not automate? What do you productize? What still needs to be in person? And then, there's AI that comes along. But yeah, really the core of it was let's build a real-time synchronous classroom the same way there's a normal classroom, because we know that works. And let's see if that can transfer to the internet. And it totally can. Okay, well then, what are the pieces of that are inflexible or annoying that product can take care of? So, we were growing extremely quickly in the early days, and I ran the numbers once and realized we would pay people to go in the Zoom and take attendance, because Zoom didn't have an API yet, and we didn't have we didn't have accounts that would map from our platform to your Zoom username. So someone would have to go in and manually take attendance. And I was like, that's costing us like $25,000 a week to take attendance. That's crazy. Like, there are things that software is really good at. There are things that software is really bad at. There is not a world where software is worse at taking attendance than a human. So let's, start building that. And over time, you get the right mix of what is product and what is people. And I think that's perhaps the most important question in modern online education. You can do everything completely manually, and it's extremely expensive and extremely hard to keep quality high. It doesn't scale. Or you can do everything completely productized and say, good luck. And it's very cheap, but it doesn't work. So you have to find the right balance between the two.
That's a sort of personal pet peeve of mine. Like, what is the right balance between those two? Because so many investors want to push companies to be productize everything. It's all tech related. It's all scale, which of course leads to massive margins and the ability to just scale in an unlimited fashion. Yet so many of those companies fail if you try just to do that all in code right off.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we've tried so many versions where it's like, okay, everything that you could possibly want, from videos to assignments to, AI driven, Q&A, is all right there for you. Good luck. And there are some people who do well in that. There are, probably less than 10% of people that you would enroll in a class are like, oh, this is awesome. This is all I need. I'm off to the races. The same way if you gave people a textbook and said, learn from that. There are going to be people who are going to learn from the textbook, but that's not the vast majority of people. So, we've distilled in some ways that we, talk about and share internally. When's a moment of frustration? Where do you go? Who do you reach out to? When you need customized feedback on something, what's the delta between, originally it was if you go to like a Q&A forum versus AI versus a person. And then layered beyond that, from a company perspective, what person are you going to? Are you going to an instructor with 50 years of experience who costs $150 an hour? Or do you need to talk to somebody who costs $20 an hour, who, is one step ahead of you in the curriculum? Because, and from a business standpoint, it's important to not have the most expensive people troubleshooting the most trivial tasks all day. And so, there's a balancing act, and you kind of figure out really by trial and error what works and what doesn't. And I wouldn't say that we're perfect at it, but I've learned a whole lot over the past 6 or 7 years about, you know, what computers are good at and when humans need humans involved.
Are there actually on the note? I mean, are there heuristics or details that you think are universal that you would share around like when to use humans, when to use computers, what is the right, and maybe does that change over time as well? Right, you guys have been around for a good period of time, so how does that change for a company over time in that split between the two?
Yeah, maybe there is a simple, one-liner heuristic of what it is, but I don't. If there is, I don't know what that is. We just have a million different like one-off instances. If I'm stuck troubleshooting X, should that be a human, AI, computer? If I if I have completed something and need encouragement, should that be human, AI, computer? And really, one of the ways I think about BloomTech is it's a giant psychology company. The we do have very unique curriculum that you can't find in its entirety from point A to point Z all in one place. But you can learn to code with curriculum that's out there. You can piece stuff together. And, anything that we teach is available elsewhere. There's nothing, with the exception possibly of our new AI course. I don't think that exists yet, and we haven't launched it yet, so it doubly doesn't exist anywhere else.
It doesn't exist anywhere yet still.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, there are definitely places you can learn to code, and you can learn to code for free. And you can, the problem is they don't layer in the human psychology aspect the way a class does. They don't have feedback the way a class does. I mean, there are reasons schools exist, even though libraries exist. And so, yeah, I don't know of a simple heuristic, but we've kind of via trial and error. One of the ways I think about BloomTech is we've made so many mistakes along the way that like you run out of mistakes to make at a certain point. And it's like, well, yeah, we know that if there's a giant tree of possibilities, we've taken all of the different branches and you're like, oh, that one works. So you have to go A, then B, then B, then B, then A, then B, then C, but yeah, maybe somebody smarter would figure it out heuristically, but we've just hit our heads against the wall for a few years and figure out where it breaks.
I mean, that's like a level of grit though that arguably a lot of founders should have. And on that note, I mean, are there rules or ideas that you've seen a lot of other entrepreneurs and you've worked with a lot in I think invest in a bunch and a lot of different things that you've done. You think about it, even for BloomTech, are there different sort of paths that like you like when you think through like actually start going back to like thinking through like competitive landscape to some extent? Like you guys have a relatively competitive landscape, I would imagine, and you've been at it for 7 years. What are the things you do to differentiate, to keep yourself around for that period of time? And then in some ways question like, why stick around for that period of time? Like what is the next big thing that keeps you energized and gets you up every morning? Because man, like when you're at it for 7 years, I mean, founders forget when you start a company, you're signing up for a 7 to 15 year journey, basically. And it is not easy every day to get up every morning and be like, man, we're going to keep pushing through and hit our head against the wall and figure out what works and what doesn't work. What are the things that help you keep going?
Yeah, I mean, and we're far from done. In many ways, we're just getting started, which is not what you would expect to hear necessarily. 7 years in and hundreds of millions of dollars raised later. But I think for me, the core problem that we're attacking is that there is so much opportunity out there that is not mapped back to people, and people don't know how to get. So I think our goal is to maximize everybody's potential. And, we first think about that economically in other ways as well. But, first and foremost, if I take a job that's unfilled and then I think about how many people are there that would kill to have that job, they're totally qualified, mentally, physically, whatever else, that just don't know how to get there, the number is astronomical. And you start, when you're dealing with income, pretty quickly, if you're trying to optimize everybody's income, you're like, oh, that's, a whole lot of, international GDP is just where are people working? Are they working in the right place? Is that optimized? And as you think, if you talk to the average person about how they ended up in the role that they're in, 95% of the time, it's like some sheer happenstance, lucky crapshoot thing. And I think we saw that in the early days when we would talk to people, we would do all sorts of tests. We try to predict who would, be the best software engineer. And we'd find these people that are making minimum wage. And we're like, holy smokes, you should be making six figures with a little bit of training, a little bit of polish. And in the very early days, people would be like, I don't believe you. But because you're guaranteeing that I don't pay if I don't make it, sure, I'll give it a shot. And if it
Sort of
doesn't
a no
work,
risk proposition.
free education. So whatever. And then, now I talk to some of those people and they're making huge amounts of money, and like they had no idea, and why would you, if you don't happen to be connected to somebody who works in tech, and you don't live in the right place, and you don't know the right people, or you didn't, happen to be in the right group, you have no idea. And so I think our job of optimizing where people are working and how they're working is a massive, massive problem. There are boot camps out there, there are colleges out there. It's a much more difficult problem to solve than I had initially anticipated, but it's so big that I continue to think it's worth going after. I mean, we've had opportunities to sell. There have been times when it felt like not very many people around the table felt like there was a market big enough to keep going after, because it just got consolidated and there's a lot of competition. But I could be doing a lot of other things, making a lot of easy money elsewhere. I am here fundamentally because I still believe in the mission. And I believe that if we execute properly, it will get really, really big and be really impactful and be one of the most important companies ever. And so that's where I'm betting with my time and my money. And I think that's an interesting, like, it has now become the main heuristic that I look for when I'm investing in a company, because I've seen, invested tiny, tiny checks in over 100 companies now. And there are a lot of companies that first sign of trouble, they say, oh, you know what? This must not be meant to be. There must not be product market fit. I'm, giving the money back to the investors. And I get that, right? Sometimes your initial hypothesis you find was totally wrong, and it makes sense. But then there are people you meet where you almost feel it. You see this look in their eye, and they're like, no, this is what I was put on the earth to do. And I am going to, you could throw any amount of trouble and failure at them, and they're going to sidestep their way around it and figure it out. To me, that's the single most important kind of factor in whether or not a company does really well. And there are companies that it's easier at times, it's harder at times. But when I get to know some of the best companies ever, every single company I've talked to, there are times where they're like, oh my gosh, can we do this? Is there a there there? Does this make any sense? And one way or another, they keep going. And obviously that's selection bias, and it doesn't necessarily mean if you keep going you will be successful, but I think that's a prerequisite for potentially being successful.
Right. You almost need to be you need to be in the game to even have a chance to win it, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that means you need to be there. And do you think, would you like to find that as, I'm kind of put words in your mouth, but is that like grit? Basically just like founders who have grit. And then how do you judge that grit, or can you train yourself to can you train or convince yourself as a founder to have that level of grit and just say, I'm just going to keep sticking with it every day? Or is it something that's just is inherent, going back to where you started? Hey, you just were someone who's I'm going to go figure this out and be in my car with my $500 in my savings account and go for it because I have that grit and I don't have any fear, right? The worst outcome is actually not that bad. What is it about individuals, and how did the best entrepreneurs get themselves to that place, or are they born with it?
Yeah, I definitely don't think it's lack of fear. I mean, I've talked to founders that are extremely successful now in times when they were questioning everything about themselves and the company. And I know one founder comes to mind who's started a company that failed, and then he started another company that succeeded, but now he's on his third company, and they're growing so fast. It's wouldn't say I've never seen anything like it. I've seen things like it, but they've clearly struck on something. But between company one and company two, when he had only started a failing company, that's a rough spot to be, because as a CEO, your only job is to make the company successful. So if the company fails, by definition, you have failed at everything that you're doing. And I remember talking to him, like, he's like, I don't know if I'm capable of doing anything. I don't have, like, I wasn't programming all day. I'm not as good a programmer as the programmers. I'm not as good a salesperson as the salespeople. Clearly, I can say that I'm an operator, but how can I say that I'm an operator when the company just failed? But I think at the end of the day, and I don't know how to cause it or create it so much as identify it, but there is, and maybe it's a psychology thing, but there are people for whom you can tell that they believe so deeply that they are going to be successful that you could throw anything at them and they'll figure it out. And I don't know if that's the right mix of, mission or product or market or whatever, but it does tend to repeat itself as well. So when you see people who are hyper successful and they're going at it a second time, it's not a guarantee of success, but the likelihood of success is much higher. So that's the number one thing that I look for in a founder is this a, hey, let's try it and see if it happens? What happens when you're going to run into adversity? And really, at the end of the day, do you actually, in your heart of hearts, in your subconscious, unconscious, do you believe what you're telling me right now as a potential investor? The amount of time, and you can be wrong, I'm okay with that, but the amount of time that it's clear that somebody doesn't really believe what they're saying is like 95%, 99% maybe. I don't know. And it's just, you can change your psychology and stuff along the way, but if you don't actually believe, it's really, really unlikely for the company to be successful.
Do you think though, then that means you have to have a level of like kind of believing your own bullshit or making up stories that you're telling yourself? Because to be an entrepreneur, almost by definition, you're trying to do something that hasn't been done before. And it's going to look crazy to everybody else. So you have to believe that this is something real, even when everyone else is like, no, like you should stay in college. Like, this is crazy, Austen, stay in college. And you just have to believe. But that takes a level of its own sort of insanity to say that and do that. Is that what you feel too for entrepreneurs you've worked with?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, yeah, I get that it's a figure of speech, but I wouldn't call it insanity, because the founders I've talked to who are most successful, like, they simply understand something that other people don't.
A unique insight
Oftentimes,
that just is unclear to everyone.
yeah, oftentimes if they were to explain it to you, you would, definitely people will disagree, but some people will agree. And there are, we've talked about adversity. There are companies that it feels like, I mean, you look at Google, right? Like, Google, when it was like 3 years old, was doing 100 million a year in revenue and growing like crazy. And they never, if they hit a rough patch, it was in the earliest weeks ever, because 5 years in, they were doing $1 billion in revenue. Like, there are instances like that. So I don't think it's necessarily, I guess earlier I said, I think pretty much every company hits its rough patches. Maybe that's not even true. Maybe sometimes it's just really easy, but that's not the vast majority of the time. It's not quite that up and to the right all the time. But what was the original question? The original question is, do you have to be delusional to some extent? My answer to that is, you don't have to be delusional. You do have to believe, even when other people around you don't believe. And I would argue that it's actually very important that you're not delusional, in a sense of, like, you can be too optimistic about how things will work out, but at the end of the day, you do have to be right. So
Yep.
Elon can be as delusional as he wants about what's going to happen to rockets, but if the rockets don't take off and land and sell, then SpaceX is done. So you can be hyper optimistic, and you can, and most entrepreneurs will predict that things will happen more smoothly than they eventually do. And maybe you believe that this will happen, and the rest of the world believes that this will happen, and in reality that happens, where it's closer to your belief than it was to the median belief. But I also, I have learned to greatly distrust the collective wisdom of what is possible and what's impossible. And largely because in a lot of spaces, no one's really trying anything.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah.
What do you think that, I mean, so when you think through all these founders, though, the ones who are sort of the most successful in the timeline it takes to get there, right? You're sort of saying like you need to it takes time to prove out if you're right or what is the right element, right? You're 7 years now into BloomTech. It sounds like you still think there could be another 7 to 10 years to go really get it right, but you still believe that opportunity is there. How much are the other great founders out there sort of like that, where there's like, I'm just going to keep pushing through? Like, once again, yeah, there's those examples of Google and Facebook that just like took off, but so many other companies didn't. They had so many hard patches to get there, and frankly, most do. What, like, when does a founder decide, hey, I'm going to give up, and this isn't a good use of my time anymore? How do they make that choice? I'm sure you invested in companies that have also failed, even when you think the founder was the smartest, brightest, like it just had all the elements going for them, and they still decided, I'm going to shut this down, and because it's not worth my time anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two ways that companies die, and this is true in every case. One is when the company runs out of money. There are instances where a founder still believes and just can't convince anybody else. And convincing people, how difficult it is to convince people changes wildly based on market sentiment and what else is happening in the space. I mean, speaking personally on this one, there have been times when it took me a month to raise $1 million of just constantly, talking to everybody you could. And there are times when I remember one specific instance where I got my hair cut and then I looked back at my emails and there were like $3 million, dollars worth of potential investment in my
It's like 30 minutes later.
Well, I got my hair cut and I wasn't even doing anything for it. So there's definitely, ebbs and flows. And, if there are people who raised in 2021 that would not have been able to raise in 2024, right? I think most people understand that. But there are times when you can't find anybody else to believe in you and you don't have enough cash to keep going. You have liabilities and you have to close the door. That's rare, especially in the modern day and age where, I have seen companies cut from 50 people to 3 people to conserve cash and, keep going. And sometimes that's a great move. Sometimes I wish I would have made moves like that, perhaps not to that extent quite so much earlier, and just could have had a mountain of cash if I would have conserved it more. But the main reason companies die is because the founders no longer believe in the company. And that can be, the space has changed. I mean, I've invested in companies in like early 2020 that now exactly what they were hoping to have an army of people overseas doing is completely automated by AI in a way that, if you're like, one example, and this isn't one that I, invested in, was they were matching visual artists in, low cost areas with companies in the US. And now it's like, that is so crushed by AI. It's not even, and even if you understood what was happening within OpenAI in, early 2020, I don't know that you would have understood how, to the extent to which visual art would be crushed.
I don't think anyone fully understood. And I think most people still don't really know can't fully grok what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's
so many industries right now.
It's going to be a wild few years. Like, everybody is still underestimating it. But yeah, the big thing is, does the founder still believe enough that they can see a path? And then, interestingly, sometimes is it worth it for the founder to keep going? Because there is opportunity cost, right? I'm very certain that I could quit BloomTech today and make $1 million a year plus carry investing for the rest of my life if I wanted to. That would not be hard. Yeah, here I am paying myself a very small fraction of that and taking the rest in equity because I believe. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think, and there's circumstances that change around a company, markets shift, people come and go, technology comes and goes, and sometimes you learn about the market. Everybody learns that it's harder than they originally anticipated, and sometimes those things that you learn say, you know what, this juice isn't worth the squeeze anymore. I think if I didn't believe in BloomTech, it would 100% be dead. There is 0% chance that we would still be going if I personally didn't believe.
How do you build then a team that believes with you and will grow with you? And what have you done kind of over the past 7 years that has maybe changed when it comes to building that team, right? Because yeah, sure, it still needs you as the founder who believes, but you can't do it all by yourself. So how do you go about building a great team, keeping that team motivated, keeping them around even when there are those tough times?
Yeah, so I mean, the team does change over time for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with the company. You need different people at different stages.
Do you have any of the original people who were with you in the first year? Are they still with you today?
Yeah, not a ton of them, but yeah, it's probably less than 50%. I mean, it's been
That's
7
pretty
years.
good. Under 50%, if 7 years later, is actually super impressive.
Well, 1% would be under 50%. I don't know where. It's definitely under 50%. I don't know what the exact number is. There's still
true.
A bunch of folks. But yeah, I think I learned a lot about this as we became, for a while, I think we were one of the hotter startups in the Valley. I wake up in the morning to 100 emails from people who wanted to invest and wanted to work with us and whatever else. And most of the people that we hired in that phase, you hit the very first tiny bump in the road and they're all gone. I mean, we're not even talking about like, we've hit a lot of really big bumps along the way, but like we're talking, hey, we were growing at X and we grew at X minus 10% last month. They're like, oh, it's like, I'm out of here. And they jump to the next company that was growing really quickly. And then they'll jump to the next company. And by the way, some of those people made a whole lot of money because it just takes being at the right company at the right time once. And that's, I wouldn't say I respect that a lot. But I get it. I understand if you want to like maximize your financial outcome while minimizing risk, you just join the hottest company you can and then bail at the first sign of trouble and hope that they don't recover from that, or you'll feel really dumb about the opportunity cost.
Totally.
But yeah, the folks that I have around the table now they're true believers. Like they actually, and they believe in the long term, not just in like what happens with our numbers next month. I wouldn't say it's irrelevant. We learn from that, but they still see the opportunities. They see the market. They see the team that we've put together. They think that we're going after it in the best way that we know how, and they're along for that ride. Frankly, most of them could make more money short term elsewhere. I'm certain all of them could work less hard elsewhere. But then, I also had, this might be sharing a little too much, but in the early days of the company, when we were maybe a year or two old, maybe less than 2 years old, we had offers to sell the company that I would have made huge amounts of money. I would be I could retire if I want. And I think one of the reasons that we're still going is because when I looked at like, I came from being broker than broke very shortly before that. So it was still, visceral in my mind what it was like to be scrounging for every dollar that you could. But I had a unique opportunity, I think, to look at that, to say, okay, if I had, X million dollars in my bank account, what would I wake up the next morning and want to do? And the main reason we didn't sell is, and I didn't even tell 99% of people involved that this was ever an option, was because I was like, well, if you gave me all of that money tomorrow and you took the company away, I would just try to start the company again because I'm such a big believer in this needing to happen. And so if that's the case, what would I use that money for? I could buy a big house. I could buy a fast car. I don't really care. I need this company to happen and be successful. And that's what I care about the most. So why, we've made so much progress. Why start over? And tell that to the potential acquirers that wasn't the story, of course, but that's how I feel today. I know I could make easy money elsewhere. I know I could, do any number of things. I could quasi retire and invest if I wanted to, but I don't. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you think so? So it sounds like there's sort of no regrets, even though the opportunity costs are obviously high. Like you could have taken that money, you could have said, "Okay, I'm gonna go chill at the acquirer, go try to build this for a year. I come back, new bite at the apple, fresh team, fresh funding. I now got a lot more money, a lot more zeros in my bank. Not zeros the right way to put it, but like a lot more combos, I suppose, in my bank account. But it sounds like no regret. And do you think that's the case for many of the founders that are out there? Because if you build a successful company, you're gonna have opportunities to sell throughout the course of that company's lifetime. And you either keep saying no, or at some point you say yes, but there's a risk reward factor, right? The longer you keep saying no, the higher the hurdle rate you have to get to get a real exit. And you might miss out. You can miss the whole market. You could end up, there's lots of companies that go public. They seem great. And then 2 years later, they're worth a few cents a share and go basically bankrupt and go out of business. So
Yeah, definitely.
how do you decide?
The calculus changes over time. Like for me to make $1 from the stock that I initially held, the founding of the company, I differentiate that just because I've put money into the company now, so that's preferred, and I would make that back. But yeah, we have to, if we sold for less than $100 million, I would see nothing, right? So my belief has to not only be that we can sell, but we can sell for more than that, which is it's not an impossibly high bar, but that's a high bar for me to see my first penny, And I think, there may be, like, I don't hold any animus against, people who want to hit a single and, set themselves up with more optionality. There's nothing wrong with that, or go bigger next time. I know people who have, I know a guy who started a company, grew it really big, sold it. The acquiring company totally mismanaged it. It went to zero, and then he bought it out of bankruptcy again, grew it really big again, sold it again. You can make a lot of money that way.
Yeah, totally.
A lot of acquirers are really not great at running companies, but that just didn't. And that may have been what happened with us. Probably not, because some of the company that they bought instead of us at that time is still around. I think you could still start a competitor, but no, I think it's, I think about that in the same way that I think about, as an example, when we were in Y Combinator deciding if we wanted to fundraise, which now it sounds crazy. There was a time when we were like, do we want to raise at all out of Y Combinator? Because we're barely cash flow positive. We weren't
just being cash flow positive is a big deal.
Yeah, we weren't printing money by any means, but we were doing okay. And I kind of ran the model and said, okay, for this to get to where I want us to go with generating that amount of revenue and reinvesting the profit, it will take 20 years for us to be anything meaningful. And if I raise this round of funding, oh my gosh, our growth rate we can do so much more, so much faster. So it made sense. That's how I calculated whether we wanted to raise or not at all. And I still think that way. I try to think that way with each incremental round of funding. Like, what are our options? If our spend is X and our revenue is Y, we can. And I think I didn't understand early enough how much that playbook is real. Like, you control all of the expenses. You can spend as much or as little as you want. The revenue you are trying to grow, we're in, we do a decent amount of revenue now. It's not, we're not outrageously a lot of revenue, but it's a real number, and it's material, of course. And I think the future, there are companies where generally, if you look at a really successful company, when you kind of zoom in to the early years, it's either flatlining or it's going like this. I think of like Figma as an example. Yeah, they were just putting along for, I think, 7 or 8 years, even longer than, I mean, we're at least doing material revenue. They were doing virtually nothing, and then all of a sudden blew up. And that's not every company. Like, just because you're flatlining in the early days doesn't mean that you will blow up later. So we've kind of, been growing, just not as quickly as we would have liked in the early days. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's a calculus that you can run each time and decide what's right for you and what's right for the company. And for me, at the end of the day, like I said, I know that, there are opportunities to make a lot of money short term and even decently big amounts of money in the medium term. But I think by continuing to make this company what I think it needs to be, the amounts of money that you can make doing that are so outrageously large that it doesn't make sense to consider anything else.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
I love that. And actually, it's a good segue. I feel like we're sort of going in a philosophical direction, which I love and appreciate. And it actually goes to one of the questions I like to ask people really early on, and we're a lot further on in this before I ask it. But the podcast is about entrepreneurial excellence. So my question to you is, how do you define excellence? What does success mean or look like for you? And for other founders in your mind, like how do you define those terms? What does it look like?
yeah, I've been thinking about this, perhaps not, what is entrepreneurial excellence necessarily, but what is excellence and what makes something great.
And probably worth doing too,
Yeah,
right?
and one of the mental models that I've come to believe, whether it's true or not, who knows, is I feel like most everybody starts with like an extremely, perhaps even impossibly high standard of what they would expect. And then most failure begins by just broadening the way and lowering standards over time. And I think about that in terms of hiring. Every founder that I've ever talked to, if you say, okay, if you were to go back, back to day one, what would you do differently? Every single person says we would hire more slowly and we would increase our quality bar for hiring, because through experience you learn that if you hire the wrong person, especially if the company is growing really quickly, you can turn around and that person becomes 20 people or 50 people, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is now a problem that I've got to deal
Yeah.
with. And I don't know that I can perfectly predict even today exactly what the right person is to hire, but there have definitely been times when I'm like, that person's not great. I can already tell it, but we do need somebody there. Every single time I thought like that, it was a mistake.
Yeah.
Every single time. And it's so hard because there's this thing that you need done. You need this person, and they'd probably be able to do it, I guess. But that never goes well.
Do do you maybe pause and we'll talk about hiring for a little bit more for a second. Come back to the philosophical side of things. Like, are there rules, heuristics you use when it comes to hiring? Questions you always love to ask? Things that you do to try to get those right people, or once again avoid the bad hires as well.
Yeah, I've developed heuristics that I'm religious about for kind of the highest level employees. Because as a CEO, you're spending most of your time hiring like VP level, director level folks. You're definitely involved in decisions below that, but if you hire the wrong, C level or VP person, that's when it becomes 50. That's when it becomes a big problem. If you hire the wrong, IC person, you made a mistake and you can fire them and replace them, or they move on, whatever. But some of the biggest lessons that I learned along the way, and some of the biggest mistakes that I made, is I had a mental model in the early days, and we were growing very quickly, that I don't even know what the origin was of this thinking, but as you approach probably 50 people, you get past the point where you can have individual conversations with everybody. You get to the point where communication, all of a sudden at 50, it like just starts to break down in ways that you didn't anticipate. And so we started experiencing that. And I went to, everybody that I knew and said, hey, why, sometimes it's no one did this thing that felt so obvious. And I thought I said that we should do that, but I wasn't in the right room at the right time. And then sometimes it, comes back as like, hey, so-and-so heard you say X. And then, without context, they ended up doing, X times 5. And you're like, whoa, that's not what I meant at all. I can see how they got that. That's my bad, before you're good at communicating yet. So I had this mental model that I'm running a small startup, and I have been, I think, really, really good at running a small startup, but I need to learn how to run a big company and be really, really good at running a big company. And in retrospect now, I think that was the wrong, like entirely wrong mental model.
Okay. Why? And by the way, how big did BloomTech get? How big are you guys today? So people have a good understanding of that journey.
Yeah. So today if you look at like full-time headcount, contractors included, we're probably 50 people. So there was a time when we were at our biggest, we were probably 220 people. And then we would be hiring, I need to give you a sense of the unsustainability of this, 200 or 300 contractors a month, and then rolling them over every month or 2 months. Because we would hire a lot of our students on 2-month stints to be TAs, and then we would roll them off so they could, finish their studies. And then, so it was a giant, it was a crazy ordeal. So it was, if you were to hold an all hands with everybody, it'd be 400, 500 people.
It's crazy. So it got really big. So you went through
way too big, honestly, way too big. Yeah. But the reason it was the wrong mental model is because what you actually want as a company is not to learn how to be a big company well. You want to learn how to get bigger in headcount while continuing to act like the smallest company there is. And, I brought in people who were experts at running really big companies, and I was like, okay, show me the ways. And pretty quickly, personally, I found myself insulated from a lot of the people who were on the ground doing the work, to where if I'd go, ask somebody, hey, what's going on here? I would get, somebody would come back to me and be like, dude, you freaked that person out. Like, you can't just like be randomly going around to like, the IC level employees and asking, pushing back on them and questioning stuff. Like, you need to grow up and act like a real CEO. And I was like, oh shoot. Okay. In retrospect, what I should have done is set the expectation that I'm going to be in the weeds on everything and expect that. And it's okay. I'm not your enemy. We're all on the same team. And I should have expected that at every level of the organization. And what I tweeted about this in kind of a tweet storm that I called there's the death spiral of bullshit, which is, you hire people who are just managing and they're not doing work. And so they spend all of their time creating fancy presentations and displaying information the way that it wants to be displayed. And pretty soon the people below them realize that the way to make progress is to have fancy presentations. And then all of the people who are building stuff are like, this is bullshit, I'm leaving. And pretty soon you're like, oh my gosh, everybody around me is just creating presentations. And, like the worst it got when I realized something needed to change, we'd send out I would send out an email to the company once a week, which, originally was like, hey, it's good for, I can't keep in contact with everybody individually. People are always asking what's on my mind. I'll send out an email once a week to let everybody know, what I'm thinking about, what I'm looking at. Sense. Yeah, what data points are interesting. And pretty quickly it became like there would be 7 or 8 people spending half of the Friday workday like massaging every word in this email because it became of such importance that everyone was going to take it way out of context. And if I didn't mention the right person, they would be offended. If I didn't have the right balance between all of the right initiatives, people would say they felt left. It was a nightmare. And so, we acted way too much like a big company, way too much like a small company. And your original question was, what am I looking for in hiring?
But even before hold on, I want to ask them, like, what did you do to change that? So, okay, so you get massive, it's like nonstop, just like basically people pushing paper left and right, and that's the job. What it became. how did you just get rid of that mindset and say, we're going back to basics? We're going to do it differently. And what would you continue to do differently if you get back to 250 people again? How will you do it in a really different way this new time around, given all those learnings?
Yeah, it was a cultural turnaround, and it starts with changing who the team is, of course. I mean,
How did change? But I mean, you had to change who you are as a leader too, right? Because that's a culture you built. You hired people who helped build that culture, so it sort of reflected you at that time.
totally. And I mean, the honest reality for me is I, for a while, was absolutely miserable because I like it's not in my nature to like sit there and play politics and try to make sure you're not like that's so not me. But my attitude was, but I will do whatever it takes to make the company successful, and even if it's this thing that's personally I hate and is painful, that's what I need to do because I learned from all of these people who are so much more smart and experienced than I am that that's what it takes.
Theoretically, quote unquote.
Yeah, and really what I had to learn and grow into was that oftentimes my instincts were completely right, and the times that I made the biggest mistakes are the times when I fought my instinct the hardest. And the right answer was like I started jumping in the weeds with at the time it was like 4 layers below me, and like, what the hell is going on here, you guys? Like, help me understand this. And you find entire teams of 7 or 8 people where it's like, what are we doing? And it's not necessarily those individual people's fault. They were receiving direction from people who were receiving direction from people who were receiving direction from me. And you realize, like, yeah, you have to like get into the weeds really quickly and figure out what's going on and who's wasting their time and who's doing important stuff. And sometimes there are people that are working really, really hard on stuff that's really, really not scalable, or you have to help them build a process that's scalable and build it into software. Sometimes you find people that they were working really urgently on something that mattered zero to anybody whatsoever. Yeah. And that's not their fault necessarily. That's, sometimes it's lack of judgment, but sometimes it's just they're doing what they were told to do. And sometimes they even disagreed with that. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But the person on top of them says, no, dang it, go do X. And like, okay, if that's what I need to do, I'll do that.
So yeah, how do you jump into things without because it also can be slow the organization down if the CEO has to jump in everything, and that's still not scalable, right? I mean, if you're a 100, 500 person company or 10,000 person company, clearly the CEO is not jumping into everything. So what are the key things that you're outlining, or the cultural norms you're putting in place? What is the scaffolding that you create as a good CEO to enable the team to grow the way you want it to grow and not become a political beast?
Yeah, there's a delicate balance between don't need me, but don't be surprised if I'm there. Like, there are very few decisions that I want to have to sign off on, but don't think that because that's true, I'm not going to be involved. And now before I used to get in trouble with some of the VP and C-level folks of like, hey, you're micromanaging this project and that's not okay. And really it came down to like, you're freaking everybody out. And the thinking was like, because I had been so insulated from everybody, that if I just jump in and put a spotlight on you, you're like, oh my gosh. So some of it is just culturally like, you don't need to be afraid of me. I'm on the same team as you. We had to kind of learn that. And I'm going to have high expectations, and I'm going to try to push you as hard as I can to be who you want, who the company needs, who the world needs you to be. But that's not because I'm like, don't like you, that's not because I want you to succeed more than anybody on the planet wants you to succeed. I think really just when people see that and they work through problems with you, and you're working side, hand in hand with people, that fear was really kind of fake. It compounded because people said, hey, people are afraid of you, so insulate yourself. Insulating yourself compounds the fear, because then you're just this big, like, unknowable figure that comes in all hands every now and then. And I'm exaggerating quite a bit to make a point. Like
No, but I mean, I've heard this from so many big companies. Like, oh my gosh, like the CEO is coming in and it's scary. And it's like, no, like what I think it's a great point. You're on the same team. So then how do you hire the right people? Like, what are the things you look for to hire the right people who help fulfill that mindset of like, we're all on the same team? I mean, is that part of what you're looking for? Or are you,
yeah, I think that's,
I avoid someone working from a big company because that's just like, they're going to bring the wrong mindset. What are the things you look at? Or
so that there is an aspect of that, in that when I first got started, I was like, oh my gosh, that person worked at early Google. Like they must be so good, because Google was such a successful company. And what you actually find was the people who worked at Google could have been absolute bozos, and there was no reason to get anybody off of the Google train because it was all just growing so insanely fast. And it's just, so, if you talk to 10 people on the Facebook growth team, they will all claim 100% of the success of Facebook. And then you're like, actually, how much of the success of Facebook was related to you, or just it was Facebook?
dumb luck. It just took off, right time, right place. You got lucky.
So I learned when someone comes from a resume like that, you honestly have to vet them even harder than you would otherwise, because it was really easy to grow Facebook relative to something that didn't have insane product market fit. I'm not saying they didn't do anything. I'm not saying they weren't influential.
And truly, they could be probably good hires if your company is also going through hyper growth and it's easy. You maybe want those people who know how to handle that level of growth.
You're looking for people who have done it before in most instances. Yep. One thing I found is that is pretty rare, that you find someone who, hey, I just did X, now I want to come do exactly X at your company. Because if you just did X, you're like, okay, now I'm ready for X, but one position higher up, I want to move up. So you're generally hiring people who are a level below where you want them to be. And the inverse of that can be dangerous, because the selection bias of someone who's been, at a director level for 15 years and has never made it to the next level
might be a reason.
Yeah, that's not always true. There are, asterisks all over all of this stuff. But one of the biggest things that I've looked for, or that I've learned, is when you hire somebody at the higher levels of the company, VP, C level, there are people who, and maybe I'm giving too much away. Hopefully, people that I'm hiring won't see this, but
if they will, then you should give them credit and props and be
they're doing
for them.
They're doing their due diligence. Plus, they're listening to what's clearly the best podcast ever. So if you ask them, okay, what do your first 30 days look like, or we have this initial problem that we're bringing you in to solve, what do you do to solve it? This has been true in my career without exception. The worst people that you will ever hire say, okay, the first thing I need to do is I need to go build a team of 5 people who can do X. And the best people say, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump in there and solve X really quickly. And then, as that becomes too much for me, I'll add in pieces to the team that do what I can't handle. And I found that there are individuals whose entire career, I'm talking like, VP of marketing, who can't market to save their lives. They've only, and they'll be like, yeah, but that's like such an easy thing. You want to do paid marketing? I just hire a paid marketing person. They're a dime a dozen. There's a billion of them, and then you realize they're going to hire somebody, have no idea if that person is good because they don't know how to do it themselves. And pretty soon you have a team of like, 7 or 8 people. And you're like, do any of you know how to actually do what you're doing? And, then the leader will be like, oh yeah, that person's not very good. We should fire them and replace them. And then they fire them and replace them, and nothing changes. And eventually, you bring in a new leader and they're like, this is all the dumbest thing I've ever seen. What have you been wasting all this money for? And that's not necessarily indicative of a good hire. A lot of people will say, you guys are doing this terribly and have no idea what they're talking about. But there have definitely been instances where someone comes in and like, this doesn't make any sense. And the people that I brought in managing, they're not very good. Do I have permission to swap them out? And they were right. But yeah, I think if you're looking for a single heuristic, the biggest one is, do they get in the weeds and actually do the work themselves? Or do they consider themselves a hirer and a manager of the people who do the work. And if there's someone
Okay.
who doesn't see themselves as someone who does the work, 100% of the time that's been a bad hire for me.
Yeah. That's a great point.
And that's like
So
90% of people you interview. So
yeah, no, look, and because that's what people think that's what a career is about. Is like I grow my career and therefore I start managing people and all that stuff. And actually, we at Levy, we've explicitly broken up the management track in the sort of IC track and say like, they're just different ways of doing a great job. Both are important, both are wonderful, and you can go down either path, but one isn't better than the other, right? Because people have this idea like, well, a manager is the way to get more senior, and I'm like, look, some people are just not meant to be managers, and that's actually okay.
yeah, some of our best
Wanna hire.
employees are like, please don't make me manage people. Can I just like,
Yeah.
can I write code? I'm really good at that. And you're like, yeah, absolutely. Like why, especially in engineering, it's like, why are we taking our best engineer who doesn't want to manage people, forcing them to manage all day, taking them like they're the worst manager and the best engineer. Why are we making them manage? Yeah, it's
Exactly. It's a terrible use. It's a terrible swap of resources and time. Going back, I want to like really dig in there really quickly to the philosophical question around what does excellence look like and what does success mean for a founder? And maybe use yourself as a perfect example, but you know plenty of others. Like what is it financial? Is it happiness? Is it how is one defined success or excellence? Is it having multiple failures or having a ton of successful exits? That's success or excellence.
Yeah, I think, and we discovered in the early days running a school that it's a little tricky when you're defining for yourself what success is. So I love anytime that we can like use a third party test instead of creating our own test. I prefer that because then it's like, oh, we're not going to like write a test so it's so easy that we know that everybody's going to pass, so we can pat ourselves on the back. So I think the first and most important aspect of success is determining for yourself what that is and actually believing in that. So if my goal were just to make $10 million and retire, there are really, now that wasn't true earlier, but there are easy ways that I can do that and be done. And for some people, that is the definition of success. And so the definition of success is achieving the goal that you set out for. And for me, the reason I'm not doing that is because that's not my definition of success. For me, my definition of success is a world-changing company that gives everybody the ability to increase, to live up to their financial potential. That's what success means for me. And there are sub goals of that, which I hope to make money along the way. I think that's fair, and I hope to make one of my sub goals is I have to make money for everybody who invested in the company. And yeah, so there's little stuff like that, but I think it's just achieving your goal. There can be a billion different ways that you can achieve the goal, and it's a little risky because you can define your own goal and you can change it over time if you want to, but that's what I consider success.
And I guess it's sort of partially it's like the outcomes if you do all that right are financial outcomes, right? It's sort of the metric we judge ourselves by in the United States capitalist system. Financial success, like if you build this company that is game changing, there will almost certainly be some sort of financial outcome that is beneficial because that is a way of judging that it has some level of success, and that's sort of how you judge it. I would argue to some extent that's sort of how the system works. Is that sort of your mind too?
Yeah, Paul Graham wrote an essay that he talks about value, and the purpose of a company is to create a ton of value and then capture enough of that. Like it would be almost impossible for you to run Google and lose money. You would have to Google creates so much, and I think they're only capturing a small percentage of what they create, right? Like if you were to actually maximize and optimize, what would I pay for Google if there were no other options, although Perplexity may change that. But, if you asked me 5 years ago, what would you pay for Google? I don't even know, but it would be a lot, Yeah. And so I do think that's an accurate measure. There's a really interesting book called Double Your Profits, which is, but it talks about how, net, it is a pretty good reason. Like profit is actually a pretty good measure of, how many resources are you consuming in people's time and other people's money and other stuff? And then how much are you producing? How much are your customers giving you is a pretty good measure of that. And look, it's imperfect, but I think it's not the worst measure in the world either. So naturally, I think if you're going to create a company that changes the world as much as an Apple or a Google, there's going to be financial rewards that come along with that because you're creating so much value. So that's kind of the way I view it.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And then is there, if you were to break down everything you've learned in all of your career and stuff you read, you name it, is there one piece of advice that you would give to every entrepreneur, budding entrepreneur, successful entrepreneur, you name it, for achieving a measure of excellence? Like, how would you boil that down into kind of one piece of advice, if that's even possible? But what is your most important?
It's believing in or being able to change your psychology to the extent that what you're doing resonates with what you believe should be done. So I think a lot about the level of cognitive dissonance that you feel as a founder. I think can sometimes be the best indicator of whether you're doing the right thing. If you're like, this doesn't feel right, but I'm gonna do it anyways, you either need to learn more about what you're doing such that it does feel good, or you need to stop doing that thing. And I think that flows through to, unconsciously, subconsciously, what do you believe will happen and why? And generally, as a founder, when you're thinking about your company, what you actually believe will happen will come true. So if you believe, if you just raised a bunch of money because you could and somebody else believed in you in a way that you didn't, what has to be true for you to actually believe in that? So I think aligning your actions with your beliefs is probably the thing I wish I would have. Well, I don't know if it's the best advice that I would give, but I think that's the most important thing you can do.
Is there any specific way you think about doing that the right way, or is it just convincing yourself, learning so much about your area of expertise that it becomes something you're almost passionate about, and it becomes something you just like, you truly you feel every day, and it can get you through the tough times?
I mean, just to give you an example, right? Like if you're running a company and you were just to think to yourself, like, okay, what would have to be true for the company to be worth $1 billion? Okay, it would have to be doing 100 million a year, we'll say, in revenue. What would we have to be doing to do 100 million a year in revenue? And really quickly, you're going to run into like, oh, well, clearly this thing that we're doing, like, that's not on that path, right? So thinking from the goal or the result backwards, and like thinking through really what would that actually look like. So for me, it's like, okay, what would it look like for anybody on the planet to be able to push a button, be matched with the right job, be taken all the way there, not need any financial help, and for the company to make a bunch of money on the other side of that. Like, and I can look through what we're doing, like, oh, that's not ready yet. We need to be doing more there. And obviously, at times it's, well, we have to get through the next year and a half. So we have to be profitable at this point, so we need to do. So yeah, I think working from the backwards and being honest about what is your actual end goal. And then as you think through that, what doesn't align. And there's going to be surprises and stuff you learn along the way. You won't be perfect, but I think spending a lot of time thinking about what that end state looks like clears up a whole lot about what needs to change right now.
Yeah, no, totally fair. Well said. And actually, sort of one bonus question, if you don't mind, which is, because you think so much deeply about this, when it comes to training and retraining individuals and skill sets, how is AI going to change for all of us? Like, what is every single person, founder, entrepreneur, individual, white collar worker, blue collar worker, you name it, what do we all need to be thinking about every day to prepare ourselves for this future where AI imbues every job, if not takes many jobs?
Yeah, two things. So back in the day, we used to talk about the digital divide, being there are people who have access to computers and the internet and people who don't. And I'm sure, people listening to this are probably on the right side of the so-called digital divide to the extent that it does exist. But I think the shift that we're seeing is going to be bigger from being in a manual brick and mortar world to a virtual world. And people who, ran headlong into the virtual world and crushed it and created, worlds and opportunity that didn't exist before. We're going to see a shift that's even bigger than that. And when I'm talking to engineers as an example, I think the difference between an engineer who is really good at using AI and an engineer who doesn't use AI and not an engineer, I think the engineer and the not engineer are going to be closer together than the engineer and the engineer who uses AI. So whatever you do, you are going to become hyper productive and 10 times as valuable if you learn how to really use AI. And I think about this a lot because we're building curriculum for how to do that. We've seen there are companies where, if an engineer uses AI a little bit, they become 2x as productive. If they use it a lot, they become 5x as productive. Holy shit, that's the biggest shift. It used to take 15 years to become 5x as productive as an engineer. But not every engineer is reaching for that. So whether you're an engineer or not, figure out how to reach for and use AI. And there's not a curriculum out there. I was just talking to very senior leaders in OpenAI and the biggest investors in AI, and like, hey, for an engineer to use AI really well, what do they need to do? And they don't know. Nobody knows. I feel like, as we're building this curriculum, I feel like if you read the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci back in the day, he'd be like, okay, I'm going to go talk to this guy and he's going to teach me how to calculate the circumference of a circle. And then I'm going to go talk to this guy and he's going to talk to me about like how veins work. And you kind of have to do that level of work right now to figure out like, okay, how does AI debug my code for me? Okay, the AI doesn't have context. How do I feed the AI enough context about my code base without doing anything that would make legal freak out? Do I have to use a local LLM to do that so that I'm not giving our entire code base to OpenAI? Those are the types of things that everybody should be thinking about, because there is going to be a distinct delta between the people who use AI and the people who don't. And I mean, there's, people can fight it. The train has left the station significantly already. It's over. So figure out how to get on board.
So essentially, you need to be on the right side of the AI divide. Otherwise, you'll be
100%.
And
it's counterintuitive, because when you first start out, you're going to be like, oh, I'm better at this. I'm faster at this. This is going to slow me down. But there's kind of that valley where you're going to feel like it's worse, but both as AI gets better and as you get better at AI. And I think for almost every field, it's more of you getting better at using AI even today. If you figure out how to get on that train, you'll be okay. If not, I don't think it looks great.
We actually call this, I think that goes, by the way, for every job out there in many ways. Like, it's actually we call it the valley of despair, where it takes some time for you. You're going to make an investment and it's going to be really hard and tough. You're going to be doing extra work to get there, but then it pays off over time. And then you come out of it and you're like, oh my God, I'm way better. So on that note, right, how can everyone get in touch with you, Austen? Like, how can they find you? How can they get in touch? How can they learn more? How can they take this new AI course when it comes out? Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm Austen on Twitter, or I guess X to be AUSTEN. And I'm Austen at BloomTech.com if you want to get in touch. And the AI course will be on BloomTech.com, and we don't have a mailing list or anything for it, but the first step is going to be taking every engineer and making them 2 to 5 times as productive using AI. And the delta that we see is already just absolutely bonkers, where an individual can do what a team used to be able to do. And I think that's coming in the next few years for everybody. So get ahead of that curve for sure.
Totally agree. Well, Austen, thank you so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it. Fascinating for me. I'm sure it will be for the audience. And thank you for the time. It means a ton.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.